It's been years. Zoom alert. All right. Well, welcome everybody. It's good to be with you this afternoon. For those of you that are joining us live, I know some of you will be watching this after the fact. So if you are watching live, I hope it's been a good morning and a good productive time getting back together, and everybody's excited to start the school year. Didn't really necessarily want to start off the school year with talk about sexual harassment, but this is something that has been on our to-do list for the last few years, making sure that we are providing adequate training to all of our employees as are required to do under federal law about recognizing and reporting sexual harassment. So I'm Scott Wolstenhume. I'm the superintendent here. And with me is Ken Marlowe, who is our Title IX coordinator. I think Ken served in that role for the last 4 years. And so Ken spent a lot of time in a number of different trainings. Every month, at least, he's in different trainings, learning about the implications of Title IX, seeing how other school districts are responding to things. It is an interesting legal space that we're in with this. There were new regulations that we received a few years ago, and then there's been changes to those, and then reversions back to the original one. So it's been a bit of an ongoing challenge for us to keep up with, but I think we're in a good spot. I think, like I said, Ken spent a lot of time in training on this, and ultimately, this is one of our fundamental responsibilities as employees, to be able to recognize when we see behavior that may be sexual harassment, that we're reporting that so that we're taking appropriate steps to intervene and make sure that all of our staff members, all of our students are safe here in our schools. So to start with, is this overarching question about what does Title IX actually address? And if you've been in education for a while, like Ken and I have, I think our thoughts about Title IX have always been around athletics.
That's where it originated, right?
Yeah. And so for us, it was what we knew coming up through the system, and with our previous, we went through some classes together, I think for ed specialist degrees. And in those law classes, we always talked about Title IX in terms of equal access to athletics and extracurriculars in sports, and making sure that both male and female sports were funded equally, that both males and females had equal access. But starting in, and so overall, that is the big picture, is it is all about discrimination on the basis of sex. And so that is the big picture, but the significant change happened, again, back in 2020, where there was a new category, or at least a newly emphasized category, about what would qualify under Title IX protection. So like we just talked about, equity in athletics has always been like the primary thing that we thought about. One that I really didn't know much about until we did some training back in 2020 was pregnancy discrimination.
Right.
So
yeah, that is a relatively new one that's going to come up.
And something, again, we don't have to deal with a lot, but it is important to know for both students and for our faculty members that Title IX does protect our employees and our students who are pregnant, to make sure that they still have equal access to our educational program. And then the one that really has gotten our attention over the last 5 to 6 years is this idea about sexual harassment and how that plays in with Title IX. And then, of course, the big idea that we talked about are any practices that would either intentionally or unintentionally discriminate against students or staff members on the basis of sex. So those big changes in Title IX, again, they happened under the Trump administration back in 2020. And that's where they clearly identified and put in additional rules that stated sexual harassment needs to be considered as part of sexual discrimination. And they put in some very specific procedures, some roles and responsibilities that every district needs to have in response to this. And it's been a bit of a challenge. And I think, Ken, you spent a lot of time working with the National Training Group. Their background is mostly in helping universities deal with this, because it's something universities have dealt with a long time.
Yeah, it really started out there. And so there's been a lot of emphasis making sure that, the female gender had just as many opportunities as the male gender, and has kind of trickled down. But then there have been some significant adds since then, and a real focus in 2020 on this idea of sexual discrimination. So then coming up with a systemic approach to how we identify whether it's Title IX, then how we investigate those, what those reports look like, what are the due process and procedures that are available to everybody involved, and then how we make a determination and actually opportunities for appeals in that process. So it can be a pretty entailed process.
Yeah, it gets to be very involved as we've seen in a few different claims that have come through the school district. So the first thing that I think is really important for our employees to recognize is what should be considered as sexual harassment. And so in the trainings we went to, in that when it first rolled out, the phrase that they used to describe it that I think has been helpful is they talked about three buckets. So there's kind of like three big ideas of things that could or should be considered as sexual harassment. So the first one, quid pro quo. Do you want to share a little bit about what quid pro quo means?
Yeah, it's that Latin term that we're trading this for that. So typically that's in, a person in a position of power or authority may offer, whether it's playing time, whether it's improved grade or some kind of benefit for another, with the understanding that it's in trade for maybe a sexual conduct of some kind that's unwelcome. So that's an important piece to keep in mind. And typically, there's an imbalance of power that we look at.
Yeah, perfect. I think that imbalance of power is super important, right? Because it's easy to look at that phrase and say unwelcome and say, well, was it unwelcome or not? But the reality is, anytime somebody in a position of power is expecting or asking for some type of sexual conduct in exchange for a favor, that should be considered as quid pro quo.
Right.
So, and I would say we're on a group national mailing list, and we see every day there's typically one or two or three questions that somebody from across the country submits and says, well, what about this or what about that? And I would say out of all those ones you've seen, it's pretty rare to see a quid pro quo.
Very rare.
Yep. So it's not that it can't happen, but it's certainly not the most prevalent. The second one would say is probably really it's the next two. It feels like it's about 50-50 between these two that we see with questions. So the second one is unwelcome sexual conduct that is so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it denies a person equal access to the district's or school's educational activities. So there's a lot to that one. And this one's been a little bit of a interesting one because, again, these regulations came in with the Trump administration back in 2020. We spent a lot of time rewriting our policy that year. Spent a lot of time in training both principals, us getting trained here at the district level about this. And one of the challenges is there isn't really a definition in the law about what severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive means. So that's where we have to do enough training that we feel comfortable making an informed decision as to whether or not conduct would qualify with that. And sometimes we're reaching out to legal counsel to help us understand that.
Right. Those are very subjective terms, right? And so a lot of the suggestions and recommendations have been that we identify and maybe create our own definitions of those and our own policies and procedures and use that as our guide. And as long as we're following those, we should be on pretty solid ground. But it is difficult because something may be severe to one person and maybe not the next.
Yeah. So what I would suggest for our employees, because that's really what we want to focus this training on, is you should not be the one that makes that determination as to whether something you see is going to be severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive. Really, if you see anything that is a concern that you think maybe, if you see any type of sexual conduct and you think, man, that does not look like that was reciprocal, or that there was consent there, or it just doesn't feel right with you. That's why we really need you to report that up to Ken as the Title IX coordinator, so that we can make that decision together. That's why we spent a lot of time in training, why we spent quite a bit of time with Ken going to different trainings so that he has that informed opinion. And again, sometimes we're reaching out to legal counsel because we don't necessarily want to make that decision by ourselves either. And then through that consultation with legal counsel, we're determining whether or not a particular behavior that has been exhibited in a school district, it does rise to that level of meeting all three of those. If you followed Title IX at all, you might have heard that definition changed. And under the Biden administration, there was a change to this exact definition. And instead of using the word and, they substituted that with the word or. And so we started to adapt our policies and change things. And then Idaho was part of about half the states in the country that filed suit against that. And so we had an injunction. So we actually never fully implemented that change. And then again, with President Trump coming back into office, that has gone back to its original definition. So we could see unwelcome sexual conduct that is severe. We could see it that's objectively offensive. But if it isn't also pervasive, then we wouldn't handle it through the Title IX process. And so again, it's just one of those responsibilities. It's a pretty heavy responsibility to make that determination. And that's why we would ask our employees that if you see anything, your job would be to report that and then let us make that legal decision on whether or not it would qualify as a Title IX issue. And then the third category, or the third bucket, is sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, or stalking, as defined in our board policy or in the Federal Clery Act, which our board policy really does mirror that. So I was not personally familiar with the Clery Act before this. It's something that it came into higher education before it ever reached K-12. But when this idea about sexual harassment being part of Title IX, all the way from public school and K-12 up through universities, when that change happened, then we had to get familiar with this. And so we'll get into some of those definitions in the Clery Act. But there are some interesting things here that I think as you're monitoring things in your schools, as you're seeing behavior, those are three pretty important ones to keep in mind. So dating violence. So you could have a situation where a male and a female, I'll just say at the high school, are dating. And if you become aware of any type of interaction where there's violence between that's going to fall under this bucket.
It would. Probably one of the important things as a mandated reporter to keep in mind is that you have to have, direct knowledge of, and it's not kind of the hearsay. You may want to report it as some hearsay to one of your administrators or something like that, so that we can follow up on it, or to a counselor to follow up on. But it may not necessarily mean a Title IX referral.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get into some of those definitions that make up the Clery Act. So the Clery Act defines what constitutes sexual assault. Some pretty uncomfortable terms here, but ones that we need to be very familiar with. So the first one is that rape obviously constitutes sexual assault. The definition in our policy that is based on Idaho state law reads: penetration of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without consent. So to Ken's point, if there is a situation, and unfortunately, I'd love to say that this has never happened in our district, but I know that there have been a couple of incidents where on an overnight trip, students have engaged in this type of behavior. So if that type of thing happens, that absolutely has to be reported back up to us to investigate as a sexual assault. Statutory rape, which the definition for that is intercourse with a person under the age of consent. So in Idaho, that means a victim whose age is younger than 16 and a perpetrator whose age is either 18 or older. So, and again, things that we have become aware of that have happened either with our students or have come to the knowledge of some of our employees, and that has to be reported. So if you have any direct knowledge of any type of even a consensual sexual relationship between somebody who is 18 or older with another individual who is younger than 16, then that is the definition for statutory rape. Or if they are 16 years old and the perpetrator is 19 or older. So again, my advice in any of these situations is for you not to necessarily make that determination, but if you hear something, if you're concerned with something, report it, and then we can do that preliminary investigation to determine whether or not it would actually meet this definition. And then in Idaho, we still have one more, and that is a victim whose age is 17 and the age of the perpetrator is 20 or older. The third category that constitutes a sexual assault is fondling, and that is touching the private parts of another individual for sexual gratification without their consent. So I think this is another one that it's not going to be an easy one for Ken and I to make the determination. Not from our school district, but on our text thread or on our email thread the other day, I noticed they were referencing a kindergarten student, right?
Right.
That was touching another one. And so as I was reading that, that would have been my first question is, was that for sexual gratification? Can you show that that was actually for that? Or is it just kindergarten students that are horsing around, know that they're not supposed to touch there, but they're not doing that for their own sexual gratification?
Right. My experience in the counseling realm has been that students of that age are not naturally sexually active and probably is not a thing. However, if it were, it would raise some red flags as to what that child may have been exposed to. So we have to look a little bit deeper too. But that is a difficult determination, and a lot of investigation goes into that portion of it as well.
And we have had students like this. I know of certain situations and they just break my heart, but we've seen children that have been sexually abused. They come to school and then their natural reaction is that they then act out on those same behaviors that they've been exposed to. And so just because something falls into Title IX, especially in that younger age group, it really then, and we'll talk about this, it means that we're going to start to trigger supports for both the victims and the perpetrators of that behavior. And so I would just encourage you to know that reporting something that falls into one of these categories doesn't mean that we're looking to try to expel the student or get rid of the student or press criminal charges. It means we need to do an investigation to see what supports do we need to put in place for them. And then if there are actions we need to take to help correct that behavior, then we'll absolutely take those. The fourth one is incest, which is sexual intercourse between persons who are related to each other. So those are like the four big categories that would constitute sexual assault. So, and that's under the Clary Act. So remember, I'm going to go back a slide. It's going to take me a minute, but just to kind of reiterate the point that that there are a number of different things that qualify in this broad category. Except I can't get my, okay. Yeah, shoot. All right. Well, I don't know if it's going to let me go back or not. But so under that big definition, we have the Clary Act, which we just talked about. That's where we also have the dating violence. We have the domestic violence and stalking as well. So again, this is really where we're, for the most part, not 100% of the time, but this is definitely where this could start to intersect with law enforcement, because we are talking about criminal behavior typically when we're talking about this third bucket. Okay, so, oh, and I didn't get my phone number in there. That's an oversight. So we'll make sure we get that number out there. So in every school, we have that Get Help app. And one of the ways we have posters with that Get Help. So that's one of the ways that either students or employees can report Title IX concerns is through that at Get Help text or the QR code that's on those posters. You can also do that through the website, d93.org/get help, or you could email Ken at title9@d93mail.com, and there's a phone number there. So lots of different ways to report. If our employees feel like it needs to be anonymous, you can again use that web page. But I do think personally, I feel like it's super helpful that if you have concerns, to talk to your school principal about the concerns that you're seeing, and then make that report together.
Right. Yeah. In fact, in most cases, that would probably be the process I would recommend. Going through your building administration. There may be circumstances where it's maybe more expedient to maybe not, if they're not available, this, that, or whatever else. Just the situation in your mind might be dire and we need to attend to it right away. So in those cases, certainly feel free to get a hold of me by phone. I'll consult with Scott as we work in tandem on this and make sure that we're providing all those supportive measures and doing our due diligence as far as investigation.
Yeah. So we'll make sure that we get that overall kind of a summary of this out to folks. But in all of our weekly updates, we have that information about how to report things that are concerns. And so always look for that information there if you don't remember where to find that. Okay. So again, just to reiterate what we've talked about, as we talk about reporting sexual harassment, our legal responsibility, and it really is a legal responsibility. So if we neglect to do this, then we're not just violating our board policy, we're violating federal law, which is a serious concern. So our responsibility is to report any direct knowledge of behavior that may potentially be sexual harassment. So I know you talked about that once, Kim, but maybe just one more time. Do you want to maybe reiterate what direct knowledge means?
So if you have witnessed or you have seen, or either the respondent or the what's the other term? Respondent or complainant have shared with you some information that took place, then you become kind of that direct knowledge person. If it's rumor mill and other kids are talking about it or this, that, or whatever else, it still may be something that we want to look into, but there's no culpability in that if you don't have direct knowledge. So that's probably an important piece to keep in mind as well. The big thing is that we want to wrap support around all of our students. And if there's a concern out there that makes the hair on the back of your neck rise a little bit, we probably want to follow up and consult with somebody on this.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, Ken, because there is one other limitation around what we're responsible for as a school district and what we're not, and that has to do with whether or not the students or the employees are within our scope of supervision, whether the activity is. Those are all determinations that Ken will make typically in consultation with me if something gets reported. So if you hear something, our preference is to report that so we can provide that supportive measures, even if we're not going to follow through and have to do a full investigation because whatever happened didn't fall underneath our supervision. So I wouldn't look at a situation and say, well, I'm not going to report that because that didn't happen at school. I'd always err on the side of caution. I'd reach out to my principal. I'd talk through it, share it up with Ken, because again, even if it doesn't fall within our scope of authority, it doesn't mean that student may not need some help and support from us to work through whatever situation they're in.
Do you know, Scott, there's one other piece too that's not on one of our slides that has to do with what is our responsibility as far as when these things take place. Are we just looking at, between the hours of like 7:30 and 3:30 for elementary, 8 to 4 for secondary? It actually extends well beyond that, in the sense that if it is a school function or supported or a district function activity, we have responsibility. So it may be on an away trip and on a weekend and travel on a bus, we're still responsible for those things.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so that's the first thing, is just highlighting and emphasizing what we need to report. A second one, I know that this can be difficult, but it really is super important to not promise confidentiality to students or colleagues. And so if you do have a student that comes to you and says, hey, can I share with you something, but I need you to promise me you can keep it confidential, please don't make that promise, because that's going to put you in an impossible situation between hearing something that you now have a legal responsibility to report and breaking that promise to a student. So we'd really encourage you to say, it depends. If I can keep it confidential, I will. But there are some things that if you tell me, I'm going to have to report it. And those things would be sexual harassment. It could be abuse. It could be suicidal ideations. There are a number of things that we have a professional responsibility to report. So you want to be super careful when students come to you and want to share things. We absolutely want you to be in a position to be there for kids and to be somebody that kids will share things with. But please don't do that for the sake of at the risk, is what I want to say, at the risk of risking your professional credentials, because you made a promise and now you're in a catch-22 because you have a promise to a kid plus a legal and ethical responsibility to report those things. Okay, and I think we've hit this point a couple of times, but even if you're unsure, please report it and then let us make that determination on it. And as we talked about, if you don't report, that could absolutely lead to disciplinary action as well as liability for the district. And the reality is we have lived through some liability with this when we've had employees that have failed to report things that should have been reported to us. So the last thing I think we wanted to talk about, we've talked about this a bit, but that is one of our responsibilities is to provide supportive measures. And again, that's for both the complainant, the person who reports to us, what has happened to them, as well as for the person that's been accused of that or reported to have done those things, that we need to provide supportive measures for both of those. And this can be a bit of a frustration, I think, in the process, because sometimes people just immediately want a student to be suspended from school because, hey, this is just reported that this had happened. A Title IX, if it truly is a Title IX case, doesn't really let us do that. We have to offer supportive measures. We can take, in some cases, some intervening measures to separate the students from each other. But the truth is, we have to go through a pretty exhaustive process to investigate to determine the veracity of the claims and the responsibility of those claims before we can take disciplinary action. So, but so in that process or through that process, we have that a responsibility to provide supportive measures to make sure kids are safe.
Right. I think of it because it's a legal process. There's due process rights that everybody has. And just because somebody has been accused of something doesn't mean we get to act on that right away. And that is a frustration, I think, for a lot of people not recognizing, all those safeguards that are in place to protect all parties. So, but supportive measures are something that we should and could and will provide in any circumstances for both the respondent and for the here I go with that term. Complainant.
Yeah.
Again.
And I think one just key thing on that second bullet is just because something gets reported, again, we will still look to provide supportive measures, even if it doesn't necessarily rise to Title IX or that individual doesn't follow through with a formal complaint. So just overall, just to kind of paint a big picture of this, this is our training to say all of our staff members have that responsibility to report concerns, and that's literally anybody who is employed or a volunteer with the school district. And then Ken's primary responsibility, and I provide backup to Ken and help support him with this, is to take complaints to determine whether or not they are do rise the level of being Title IX. And if they do, then to organize our next steps in response to that. And then Title IX is very clear that there's a separation of responsibilities. We have to have somebody else come in and do an investigation into that conduct. And so Ken doesn't do the investigation. I don't do the investigation. We do have some principals that are trained to be investigators. I think the more we get into this, the more we're looking to use outside legal counsel to do that independent investigation. So it's truly independent outside of the school district. And then they write a report of what they find. That report gets submitted to us. And then again, still a separate party has to make a decision as to whether or not that's who was responsible for what conduct and what action should be taken. And so Jason Lords and Heath Jackson are two individuals we've designated as decision makers. They've been trained on that. Typically, Jason will do findings for students, and typically Heath would do it for staff members. But that's not a black and white line. That's like a typical assignment of responsibility, but either one of them can make a decision for any type of claim that's brought forward. So there is a lot of just separation of responsibilities, keeps things independent, keeps Ken and I from being overly involved at that initial level so that we can just provide support to the people that are involved with it throughout the process.
As my role as the coordinator for Title IX, it would be more as an orchestrator, trying to make sure that everything's lined up, that we get the right information, that we adhere to the timelines, we get the right people involved, and we do the process correctly. And so I train in all the areas just so that I can be a resource and kind of a support to each of those components.
Perfect. So thank you for your time. It looks like we're coming right up on 2:00, and I know we need to switch over to Parent Square, so don't have a lot of time for questions. But if you do have questions from this, feel free to share those with your principals. They can email them to us. This is something we can continue to provide updates to our employees either through this format or through our weekly updates. So thank you for spending the last 30 minutes with us, and have a good rest of your afternoon.